All right, we're going to go ahead and start. So, okay. Naj will not be here this evening, but he should be at the next meeting. And Julie wasn't here, okay, so hello if you haven't had a chance.
I'm not contagious anymore. So we're good.
So, anyways, we did do introductions last time, so you just want to introduce yourself?
Okay. Julie Marston. I have a 12-year-old son who goes to Elkridge Landing. Fourth generation Elkridgean, I guess you could say. We're born and raised. Just looking forward to see what we can figure out.
All right, so why don't we go ahead and get started? Did everybody get a chance to look at the meeting from May 7th? Excuse me, the meeting minutes from May 7th? Yeah. Any questions, concerns? No? Would somebody like to put the motion close too?
Better notes than I took. So I move to approve them.
I second. All in favor? Okay.
Aye.
All right. Easy peasy. Okay. So Renee is going to be here. She's here. Sorry. It's Monday. We're just saying, it feels like a Monday. And then we said, it's Monday. So Renee's going to be presenting this evening.
Sure.
I'll take it away.
Sure. I wish I had a dark screen over here so y'all could see it. I do have a copy of this presentation in front of you.
Actually, before you start, we should probably, we have some guests here.
Yes.
So if you could just stand up and introduce yourself.
Dan Ludwig, Manager of Design and Construction Services for High Public School System.
Good afternoon. I'm Bruce Gist, Executive Director for Capital Planning and Operations.
Hi, I'm Karen Lasser. I'm Deputy Chief of Staff in the Executive's Office.
Some audience members.
I'm Jen Mallow. I'm a candidate for Board of Education.
I'm Deepa Jaffrey, concerned citizen and resident of Elkridge.
Thank you everyone for being here. Appreciate it. All right.
So I brought with me tonight, so you guys, everyone knows who I am, right? Renee Kamen, Manager of School Planning. I am one of your advisors for this journey. I brought with me tonight Dan and Bruce, primarily because we work as a big team in our offices. Dan and I constantly are working together, but I wanted to take you guys through our planning process, our capital planning process, and it's not just me and my office, it also involves Dan's office, which is Office of School Construction, and Bruce Gist oversees both of our organizations, so he is he bridges any necessary conversations between our offices, but like I said, we're constantly on the phone talking to each other. I wanted to start back from the beginning to let everybody know this is our yearly cycle. It is non-stop in our office. We really don't have a break in between any processes. Once the feasibility study is released, we kick right over into the capital budget. And as the capital budget is going on, we are constantly in a move. So what my office primarily does is our enrollment projections, facilities planning, attendance area adjustments, and geographic information systems. So first we figure out our enrollment projections, what the county is going to look like, what each level is going to look like, and we produce a by grade breakdown for the first year of our projection, and that actually feeds over into our operations side and staffing and buying books. So when we were doing attendance area adjustments for Hanover Hills Elementary School, we were also trying to produce a general projection so that on the operations side, the operational budget side, they were able to plan ahead of time, even before the decision to make the attendance area occur. So it's one of those things where we're constantly doing, we're not constantly doing our projection, but we're trying to anticipate everything well in advance so that all the planning for the entire school system can go quite smoothly. One of the things that I try to highlight, but you can't really see, is land acquisition. So we have our regular duties, which is enrollment projections, feasibility study, redistricting, but we also have these ongoing tasks, land acquisition. One thing I will tell you about our office is we are not real estate agents. So we don't have the ability to constantly check the market. So notifications for land acquisition can come from A, me actively searching, me or my staff actively searching, B, through conversations with the Department of Public Works or even Howard County Recreation Department. So we get notifications in a variety of different ways. We have two ways of doing it. We can go outright and purchase. I'm going to go to the next slide. Go outright and purchase, or we can make, if we know there's a master plan area like Turf Valley, for example, and we know it's a very long process, we have the development review process, which sets aside land, so I'll talk about that in a second. So my office is guided by 4 policies. The first and foremost is site acquisition, which we'll get into a little bit. The second is the school attendance area, and the 6010 actually sets up our work program for the year, essentially. What all the expectations are of the board to the superintendent, and my office, in this instance, is his designee for projections and presenting projections. Then we also have 6020, which is school planning and school construction programs, and then if the discontinuation of school use. So if we decide that we don't need a property because of projections, or even the county comes to us and say, hey, we need a portion of your property to do X, Y, and Z. We use the discontinuation of school use policy in order to dispose of all properties or portions of properties in our cycle. So we're primarily here to discuss site acquisition. I created this graphic last fall for the Mission Road because everybody can read policy, but really what does policy mean? How does it get implemented? So the first step in all of this is we have to identify the need. And the need is identified through the annual feasibility study, and that actually is identified in the policy that says we have to identify the need up front and center. So once we identify a need, for example, we identified the need for Turf Valley probably about 10 or so years ago, and Bruce is really here also because of the historical component, so he can fill in some of the history blanks. So a land developer comes in and they have this master plan, and they say, I want to develop X number of units, and we are involved sometimes at the very basic level of this person wants to build, I'm going to say 1,000 units. What does that look on the school system, and is there land available within that so many hundreds of acres that we're able to acquire land as a route through the development review process. Once we identify, then the next step is identifying those potential sites, like I said from before. We can do that either via a real estate agent. We could hire a real estate agent, although I'm not, I don't believe we have in any recent amount of times. It was basically my predecessor going out and finding properties and using using an attorney to acquire land. But we can also identify sites through the Department of Public Works. I got a phone call a couple of weeks ago from Howard County Park and Rec about a property all the way in the west. Could that be used as a site? And I said no, because our population is in the east. Excuse me. And then we can also identify sites through the development review process as kind of secondary. If that large developer comes in and is doing a massive scale development, we have the ability to reserve land through the development review process. And it's a 3-year reservation on the property. We would still have to acquire the land after that 3 years. So we determine the need. We would have to reserve the property through the Howard County regulations. And then we have 3 years to negotiate a fair market value and acquire that site. Downtown Columbia is unique in respect to when James Rouse first came in, his whole vision included all functions of community use. So school was one of those components. Whereas now we would be doing it through maybe a comprehensive plan amendment, or if individual parcels come in and we've worked through a master plan process. So So there's a little bit of nuance, a difference between Columbia. Columbia happened over 30, 40 years ago, and there was a very extensive process in which the developer, as he was going through the different pods of Columbia, the different neighborhoods, would say, okay, planning staff, here's where we think we should put a school tied to different uses. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And work it out that way. That was one way we got land back in the 80s and the 90s. And then the second way, at least for modern day, if we don't have money, big, large developments with lots of units and lots of acreage left in this county, but when they're coming in through a zoning, either a change for the general plan or even with the zoning amendment, we say, wait a second, hold up, I think we need a site here. So we would have that conversation way before. Then once we identify a site, we have in our policy, which is our considerations, and there are 6 considerations that we have. Is it sufficient and appropriate acreage? So someone can identify 100 acres, which is great, but then all of a sudden there's forest conservation on it, environmental constraints, topography, all of those other factors that we end up having to start to subtract out. So we classify it as usable acres, and that's what Dan's here to get a little bit more detail. Because just because it's 100 acres doesn't mean we can use all 100 acres, because we have to both look at the environmental side of it and also what we have to build, how many acres we need to build the building and all the bus loops, and how many acres we need for all of our field space, because there are certain minimums we should try and strive for when we're looking at different sites. And so elementary, middle, and high school all have their different components that we do. And when we co-locate, say, 2 schools on a site, we sometimes open ourselves up to having field sharing, or if we're looking at a park, field sharing. So the acreage can kind of whittle its way down from the minimum that we need, and Dan will go through all that. So then the next thing we look at is restrictions on the location of school service area. Land use and zoning comes in that respect. Sometimes land comes to us and we're like, yay! And then we start looking and there might be easements on the property that might be difficult to get rid of. For example, if it's a historic site, we have to go through that process. So looking at all the different types of easements, doing an actual search of what is on the property that could be restrictive, and then we wouldn't be able to use certain parts of the property or build to a certain height. Sometimes those types of restrictions come into play. Transportation, walkers versus bus riders. We try to find a place that looks for walkers, but we accept that we can't in all circumstances. Sufficient flexibility as the population patterns change. So we want to try and find a site that would allow for that flexibility. So if for some reason we find a site and there's no more growth projected for that area, that might lend itself to be a negative for a certain site, whereas it's in a location that we can see as the population goes up and down, because houses cycle in and out, and that's where we get our children. So that might be a site could be a better location because it allows for that flexibility. And then also the economic considerations to show the greatest degree of facility use optimization of the learning environment. Once we pass that basic litmus test at the staff level, we then ask for a closed session to the Board of Education, and we bring forth, it could be one site, it could be multiple sites, and we allow the board to have a conversation in closed session, because it's one of the, I think, 4 reasons the board can go into closed session to discuss which sites they want the school staff to pursue. And then we would kick it into the next, which would be looking at a phase 1 environmental assessment, going to a clearinghouse, asking for what we call a site review committee, which is defined in our policy as the executive director for capital planning, which is Bruce, Department of Public Works, so Jim Irving's office, and Department of Planning and Zoning, so that's Valdez's office. And they meet and they discuss the pluses and the minuses of the site. Can the site get reasonable sewer and water connection? Is it outside of the service area for sewer and water connection? What kind of comprehensive plan? Does the comprehensive plan allow a school in that site? Is it zoned? Do we have to go for a zoning amendment? Because even though we're a school system, we still have to abide by all the zoning laws, all the land use regulations, just like a regular developer would. So we have to make sure wherever we're siting a school meets with all of those different components when you're developing a piece of land. Then once all of that happens, we then go back and report back to the Board of Ed in another closed session and say, this is what we found. Do you want us to go forward and pursue it and have a conversation in public session? Or did we bring something back that is not good for the site? They tell us yes or no, and then that will kick us over into the fourth bubble here, which is our public hearing process and our report to the board. So we will have a board report that says, we have this site, we're negotiating it, our recommendation is for us to continue on with the purchase of the site. There's a public hearing, the public comes in and they weigh in, they can persuade the board to say no or yes, and then the board will act and then give us the direction to complete the process of purchase and go into the IAC approval. State approvals only last, correct me if I'm wrong, 5 years for site approval, I believe.
It's coming down to 3.
It's going to come down to 3. So we go to the clearinghouse to see if we can get a general yay or nay from the state, but then we follow up with the IAC approval once the board approves to make it a full-on approval. So I had a question from last time is what is good for a school site? So this is actually in the implementation procedures, and this is a desirable size in usable acres. So at the high school level, it's at a minimum 30, and then 1 acre for each 100 pupils. So if it's a 1,600 seat school, you're looking at about 46 acres. And then middle and elementary school. And then once we determine, we get through the site, we have the site in mind, then one of the other considerations we look at are our educational specifications. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk a little bit about like what really goes into our site.
Thank you. As Renee said, policy 6000 looks at the desirable, usable, I want to make sure everyone's clear that it's desirable and usable acreage that is needed for a site. For our high school, it is the base at 30 acres, and it's 1 acre for every 100 students beyond that. Our high schools right now are at 1,615 students. That's how you get to that 46 to 47 acres of desirable, usable acres for a high school site. Our current educational specifications that are approved by the Board of Education correspond with this as well at 47.3 acres. That includes acreage, about 8 acres for a building, about 8 acres for a parking lot, and then it has all of the athletic and physical education fields that are needed. That is our desirable and what we would like ideally to have for a high school site. We understand that as time goes on, finding that acreage is very difficult to do. So we wanted to take a step back and see what would actually be usable for a smaller site. And what we came up with is approximately 36.25 acres. What that includes is 8 acres for both the building and the parking. That would include the parking for the students, the staff, the bus loops, the drive aisles, the service drives, as well as the actual footprint of the building. And then our site and fields, all high schools have a stadium with a track. They also have tennis courts. Most of them have basketball courts. Right now, not all of our high schools do have basketball courts. Some of them do have portables that are on top of the courts for capacity needs. Field hockey court, softball, baseball, and practice field. We do have another 5% efficiency factor built into that. And really what that's going to cover is when you take a look at your site, you may have to do some grading. You may have to have some additional access drives or pathways. that's where that 5% is going to come in. It's going to allow you to make it not only so you can shove everything on there, but make it actually usable as a true high school site. This again is ideal for a standalone site. As Renee mentioned, when you get into a situation where you have two schools next to each other, for instance, Oakland Mills High School and Oakland Mills Middle School, those two sites do connect. So you do get into a situation where they can start to joint use their fields. You also have that potential situation when you get into a school next to a park area. For instance, Rockburn Elementary School. It is right next to Rockburn Branch Park. And it does utilize a field at Rockburn Branch. So what we really wanted to let you know is what that desirable usable acreage is for that standalone. It's very difficult to tell you, sure, you can go 30 if you don't necessarily have a site to look at as far as the usable or co-use of fields next to it. The other thing I want to touch on that Renee did mention is that is usable. Because when you get into a lot of the situations, especially the larger sites that you're going to find, they do have situations like wetlands, historic areas, or forest conservations, or it could be, it's a huge hill and you got a lot of grading that's going to happen. When you get into those factors, those do start to limit what you can actually truly use for your building, your parking lot, and your field. So that's why we did want to stress that that is usable site.
Sorry, real quick.
Yes.
36.25, is that assuming no increase in the acreage due to the number of students?
Yes,
Or was that based off of a certain number of students?
No, that is based off of an average of what our schools currently have. Right now, if you look at what the SPEC calls for 2 practice fields, 2 baseball fields. So unfortunately, none of our schools actually have that, so we wanted to see what was actually realistic and what would be needed for the daily use for physical education and health, as well as for the athletic fields. So right now, this is based off of the 1615. So
that's assuming 1,615 students.
Correct.
And you said none of our schools have what the policy calls for, 2 practice fields, 2 of this? None of our schools have.
The policy doesn't actually call for those. It's actually the educational specifications,
Right.
and it's what is desired if you have the allowable land.
But none of our schools have that.
That is correct. Currently.
I'm sorry, real quick. It's based off of this metric, we're at, is it 47.3 acres?
Based off of that metric, off of 1615, you get to 46 to 47.
Okay, so sorry.
The 47.3 is off of the educational specification.
Okay, and then the 36.25 is based, it hadn't been skinny down that much. What was the?
That is based off of, I didn't print that, I'm sorry, but this is the page out of the educational specifications that go through and list 1 stadium, 2 multi-fields, 8 tennis courts, 4 basketball,
Okay, so
2
you're breaking it
baseball.
down per use, but.
Exactly.
And
If
you're
we
assuming
took
the
a-
building is only 8 acre, is using up 8 acres for 1,600 students.
Correct.
Okay, got it.
Yes, and that is based off of our current prototype, which is Long Reach, Reservoir, and Marion's Ridge, which is a 3-story high school.
Will the prototype be updated for high school 13? I understand that it's not, there's codes that are outdated since the last high school was built in 2005. So is there going to be an updated prototype for high school going forward with the site design for Mission Road?
The prototype, the base building will be based off of the prototype, but as that was done several years ago, it will be updated for current codes. It will be updated for LEED. That's something that both the state requires as well as the Board of Education requires. It will also be updated per the current curriculum ideology. So we will be meeting with curriculum staff to go through and find out, how do you teach? How can we make this better? So what we don't want to do with a high school here, high school 13, any of our schools, is we don't want to build something off of the ed specs that's going to put us 5, 10, however many years behind. So absolutely, while the general shape might not change, everything will be updated every time we do a new building, yes.
So this is our general schedule. I did a linear one instead of a circle one because depending on how everybody acclimates itself. So in January, our capital planning process is about 18-month, 2-year cycle. And we start every year in the winter time with our enrollment projections. Those enrollment projections are fed into the feasibility study, which informs redistricting, capital improvements, then from there, we have the redistricting. If we go through redistricting, it happens on the side here, but we still continue to plan our capital projects and do our capital budget, which is presented in the summertime. And then our year 2, we're still doing our Board of Education review of the capital budget, but we're also starting a new projection. So it's a continual basis for us. The Board of Education is still going through their, right now actually with the County Council, their capital improvement program. And I actually now have to update this. Once the County Council and Capital Improvement Program, we close that cycle out with our school capacity charts. It used to be known as the open and closed. So from beginning to end, it's about an 18-month cycle. It will end with the capacity charts, which reflect the capital improvements for this cycle. I'm going to give you an example in a minute. Okay, so you all wanted a 101 essentially on the feasibility study. We're kind of in a weird spot right now because we're finishing up the next year's feasibility study. So what I was trying to do was give a 101 so that when the next feasibility study comes out, you can start with a fresh, clean slate, and you can get a basis of what we're trying to portray in that feasibility study. So the feasibility study has a purpose. The purpose is to inform the long-term planning process, facilitate discussions and decisions that may lay ahead. So what does that mean? That means redistricting, that means any capital improvements and the capital improvement plan. Provide strategic information to the school system, so that's such as we're looking at our projections, we've looked at our a few years past trends, and we're looking at the future, and that means we might need to look for land. It might mean that we have to look for strategic capital improvements to add seats to a school building. So even though there's a projection and we're growing, it doesn't mean that we automatically need a new school. It might mean something to that particular attendance area or a few attendance areas that are adjacent to it. And the feasibility study is also used to prepare for any redistricting. The feasibility includes student enrollment projections and trends, comprehensive strategies for the capital improvement plan, which is a 5-year plan, and then the long-range plan, which is 10 years. Why is the annual feasibility study annual? Because assumptions and trends can change. For example, development patterns can change, and we rely on the Department of Planning and Zoning to provide us new housing permits, what has been done and what is being proposed to be done. And sometimes things like economics get into the way, like a recession, and so the timing of certain units might take longer to actually come on the market or even be built. And so we look at that annually in order to continually update our assumptions. And it allows for appropriate adjustments to the capital budget or attendance area plans. For example, for the longest time, there was no funding for a 13th high school. There was no funding for a purchase of the property. It hadn't been in our capital budget for a while. So it allows us to, as those types of inputs change, to talk about those. And study and plan for population shifts with new residential development. So in 2013, the county changed its comprehensive plan and created new planning areas. And our previous feasibility studies didn't have that into it. So we incorporated and rolled it into the feasibility study. So all these factors continually change, and so we try to, at best, capture them all and put them in the feasibility study so that the capital budget, our capital budget and planning can move as all of our inputs change.
Can I ask a question? And this may be something that you're intending to cover, so
Sure.
I'm happy to wait if it's
Sure.
later. But can you talk a little bit about where the student enrollment projections come from, both for existing homes and then also for new development?
Yeah, that's actually the next slide.
Okay.
If it's not this, it's the next one.
Okay.
So our feasibility study is broken down into sections. The first section is our planning considerations, which includes our enrollment projections. It also talks about the relationship between it and the capital budget. We also talk about capacities, because capacities can change based on regional programs, and sometimes, like special education, every year might need new classroom spaces, so we every year look at our capacities. Superintendent goals can change between superintendents, also within a superintendent's term. Land use changes, as well as what is in our facility bank and what is in our land bank, which are two different things. So, on to the projection. So our projection is made up of several different things aggregated into one projection. So it's cohort survival, and what cohort survival is, the likelihood, the grade progression. So my child entered the school in kindergarten, what is her likelihood to move from K through 12? And so if it's a positive survival, which is greater than 1, that means in a certain attendance area, we do this by attendance area, in a certain attendance area, the likelihood of a child entering in first grade and going to second is going to increase, is a positive. It's going up. We also use birth data. I'll use my daughter as an example again. So we lived in Howard County when she was born. Her birth gets uploaded to the Department of Hygiene and Mental Health. We get that information. We don't get the name, but we get the location of that child, and we use that to inform our kindergarten growth. So we try to project, again, the likelihood of that child being born to hit that attendance area when they have 5. And sometimes you can see when the baby boom happens, like a blizzard. Not all the time, but you can kind of sort of see those things. Also, the new student yields from new homes. So where do we get this? From our actual data. So every year we get our September 30th, and what we can do is we can say, this is where GIS comes into play. We don't have student names, but we have locational information, and we can get pinpoint data that says, and tie it to a new residential permit. So if we have student A that comes in school year 2016, and it's at an address that is a brand new permit, we tie that to new construction yield. That lasts for 1 year, and then that child will end up going the following year into the cohort survival. So we can do the same thing with a resale. So we get information for the resale. We can tie the address to the new student to that resale. I'm making it sound a lot simpler than it really is, but it does take Tim, he's our projection person, about 3 months to collect all the data, massage all the data to get it into the GIS system, and then do all of the tagging that we call tagging. So then we can really see for that projection, or for existing data, where the new students came from. Did they come in from a new sale? Did they come in from a resale? Did they come in from an apartment turnover? So those are our 3 ways to figure out where new students come from. Yes?
So you know for every address in Howard County, how many students are coming from each one? How many?
We use that with existing data. We use our existing data to inform our projections. So
I'm not talking about projections. Do you know, for example, from any given address anywhere in Howard County, do you know how many students live there?
yes,
Okay. Do you know how many students will live there next year?
we use our projection methodology to get to that next year.
Okay.
Because migration patterns shift, so we found that between 3 and 5 years of our past data is best to use to project. So if an area, for example, has a higher rate of resales, we might say use 2-year average to calculate the resales in that attendance area for the future, for the following year.
But what do you use for apartments, where people are renting or leasing an apartment? How do you collect that data?
I'll have to check. I don't remember how we get it. I don't know who gives it to us or how we get it. But I believe that's also tied to an address, because all the apartments have an address, And so we're able to track for better or for worse, but I can get you the exact way that we do it. But I believe it's just because it's tied to an address, and we know the way that Synergy works, plus the way that our GIS works. There's a comparable tagging that we know if student X moves from an apartment over into a townhouse, we don't count that as a new student. There's a way in our system that subtracts that out. They're not a new student, but they're a new student to that school because of a sale of a townhouse or a move of some sort.
So I'm just wondering how you provide data, for example, to a developer building apartment homes. How do you, they need data, student generation data.
Yes, so
about how many students are projected to come from each side of the apartment home in the.
We don't use size. So first of all, we don't use size of apartment. The way we do our projection is either apartment or condo, townhouse, or single family detached.
It doesn't matter how many bedrooms it has?
Doesn't matter how many bedrooms it has. We haven't gotten to that finite
I assume
data.
you're getting your data from the school system, which is telling you the addresses.
Yes.
Correct?
Yeah.
So I think that's answering the question.
But,
Yeah.
well, but what I'm trying to say is, for example, like, if somebody moves into an apartment home and, with, 3 children, the chances are they're gonna be moving into a larger apartment if they can. So the 3-bedroom apartments are gonna have a different generation of birth than the 1 and 2-bedroom apartment of birth. And how can you know, like, how can your projections be accurate when you don't know how many kids are in the various sizes of apartments?
So we aggregated the attendance level area, so all of the apartments will inform that particular address. We don't go to that finite of a data. That data we, I guess, could if we chose to, but that's a lot of information, and we actually in 2015 had an outside firm look at our data accuracy and our projection accuracy and actually said we're extremely accurate and probably too complicated, and we might be able to scale back our projection data points. Like for example, in an area that's not experiencing new housing growth or construction, probably looking at taking that out of the projection. We haven't gone down that route because the level of accuracy changes, but not by that much. So we've gone down the route of, is our data accurate? The answer is yes, our data is accurate. Could it be simplified? Probably yes, depending on if we want to break down that area of non-growth versus new growth. We haven't looked at apartment yields by number of unit. I honestly don't think any school system does that because I believe Montgomery County does a standing yield for apartments in garden style 4 and below versus 4 and above. I think that's like the closest study that has ever come to it. If you know of another municipality that does it that way, I'm happy to look at it, but I'm not sure of anyone that looks at specific bedroom types. At that, it's a very granular scale. It's a very, very small scale.
But do you guys differentiate between low-rise apartments and
No, we
low-rise
do not.
apartments? You should.
We do not.
There is a significant student generation difference between high-rise apartments and low-rise apartments, garden style, low-rise apartments.
We actually are going to be, for Columbia Town Center, looking at apartment yields again. I think we're going to start that this summer and updating that. We did do that in 2014 with the onset of, with downtown development, the downtown Columbia development. So we will be looking at some level of that over the coming year in order to address the differences between the newer style apartments versus the older style apartments versus all those factors were talked about in 2014. So we have to go through that and update it, at least for downtown Columbia, but we would look countywide as a whole. You look
Sorry. At what point does the projection go into the feasibility study for new development? So is that the issuance of building permit? Okay, so if we have, for example, this happens a lot here, if we have one house that's on a large, semi-large plot of land, and then it's bought and 9 houses are put on that plot, at what point would the generation?
So it's actually in our projection well before the actual permit is pulled.
Okay.
So, for example, I don't know if anybody's been paying attention to the board's redistricting committee. That was actually a question. When do we know? We know pretty much well in advance, but we can't, I say we, but I have an equivalent on the DPZ side, which is Jeff Bronow. He knows what developments are in progress, and there's certain staging of that. That means there's an application in, and the like. There's also what is a zoning, which is very conservative. So if a property is 20 acres and it has an MXD zone on it, he will take the maximum number of dwelling units. And what he tries to do is he times it based on housing unit allocations and other factors that he knows that's occurring in that. So we do see those sometimes farther out. He gives us a 13, I believe it's a 13-year projection. So those types of situations are in our projections. Some are nearer than others, but they are there.
How far out do you project?
10 years. Well, actually 20 years. But in our feasibility study, we show our 10-year projection. So this feasibility study will go out to 2029.
Okay.
With the accuracy of projection, what range, like how far out do you look? Like 5 years out versus 10 years out?
So we started reporting that this year, and actually that's, I think, my next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay. Because we asked that a lot, especially in the development field. They're like, well, how really accurate are your 3-year projections? Because that's what developers are looking at. So we found we're between 3 and 5% off, which is pretty good for a 3-year projection. But we actually do a projection accuracy report every year, but that's on our first year accuracy. Countywide, we're 0.09% to 1.1%, and we're a little higher in the elementary, middle school, and high school. And the reason this is important is because the actual enrollments get fed into our projection for next year, so we adjust for that level of accuracy for the following year. So we're actually pretty good at the 1-year accuracy. We're about 2 to 5%, depending on the level that you're looking at. I mean level by countywide versus individual schools versus the elementary school, the middle school, and high school. Yes.
So the countywide number is accuracy of projection across the county.
Yes.
Is that fair to do because of the imbalance of enrollment between the east and the west? There's a huge overcrowding problem in the eastern part of the county and a much lower enrollment
So we do
in the west. And so when you average those numbers, they come out.
We do it at each individual school as well too. So it'll show that Howard High School, for example, last year we were 22 students off. We overprojected and 22 less students came off. So we do look at our accuracy at the school level as well, because that informs the attendance level projection that we're doing that feeds everything else that comes out of it. So we do it countywide, we do it at the individual schools. And if you're interested, we release the projection accuracy every February. So I can send you the latest report if you would like to see it. And it does actually inform the Board of Education how our error rate was. So it varies, and we'll be the first to admit that we're not perfect. Projection is a lot like the weather forecast, and the level of accuracy obviously is different. But we do find that there are some schools we just always are 7% off, like Guilford. And primarily what we have found is apartment turnover is something we really have trouble nailing because that's a very migrant population. And so there are some instances at the school level where we are off by 7%, sometimes 9%. Other schools like Manor Woods, when we were trying to, this is going back 10 years ago, we were anticipating that Turf Valley build, But what kept happening was the developer just kept pushing it off and pushing it off and pushing it off, so we were consistently had a higher error rate on that for that particular reason. So there are a lot of factors that we consider and a lot of factors that we use to build in our projection, and when things change, like the wind shifts, we don't necessarily have control over certain factors that we're looking at, so we try our best. We have found that we're pretty good at our accuracy, but again, that informs the following year projection and the following year projection, so we're constantly going back and reevaluating and looking back to see how much more we can get in accuracy in years to come.
And the projection accuracy report is just reported at the annual level, or the 10, that includes the 10-year?
No, that's just the 1 year level, because we're trying to do, we're trying to get the September 30th for the following year. So our projection for 2017, to inform the September 30th of 17, would have been reported just a couple of months. It was reported in February. So we look at this same year projection, so the 1 year.
Okay.
The other thing the feasibility study will discuss is our capacities, and we basically here show the importance of capacities on capacity utilization. So we are going to do a little bit better this year. We've had a lot of people, especially with last year, trying to figure out our pre and post charts. Their capacities are different. Why are the capacities different? So this is something that's going to be a little differently expressed. It's showing the changes of capacity. This one shows the changes of Wild Lake Middle School, right here, where it shows that Wild Lake Middle School had a capacity. I feel like I'm missing something here, but they had a capacity of yeah, here it is, 467. And it went to 760 between 2016 and 2017. That's because they had an addition. So that's what this section is really important, to show the before and after, what our assumptions are based on what we're recommending here. The capital budget process is a different process and obviously can change. This is an example of how the capacities, considerations, and the feasibility study actually relates to the capital improvement program. So every year in our feasibility study, we look at what was proposed. So this was for 2017, and we show the difference between 2016 and 2017 in terms of the feasibility study. So what this means is in 2016, you see there's Dunlogan and Ellicott Mills. So in 2016, they were in 2020 and in 2024, but this feasibility study was recommending that these two capacity projects occur in 2021, based on the projections that we are seeing. So we are showing that particular move from 2016 to 2017 in this discussion. Now, it doesn't mean that it will actually happen in the capital budget, because when you look at the capital budget page, this is really blurry. Is it?
I'm not that old, but I
Oh, the paper's
Most of them are
better.
like,
Is that better?
Yeah,
Eh?
I think we're gonna be better off.
Okay, yeah. I'll make a bigger slide. But what I think the important takeaway here is we will talk about having a capacity project in 2021, but certain factors will preclude that from happening. And these two projects down here that are highlighted, I apologize, actually are saying August 2024. So we are saying there's a recognized need in 2021, but funding constraints and funding considerations are actually making these projects come out to 2024. So the feasibility study is a way to start the conversation as to what the school needs moving forward. Again, it also goes back to saying, just because we have a population projected, it might just warrant an addition at particular middle schools versus having a brand new middle school. And so that's the kinds of discussions that we have throughout the feasibility study. Sure.
All this is saying Columbia East. This is the Columbia East.
Yes.
That's what we're working on, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I just randomly picked, so you know, yeah.
I'm just making sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And so here's another example too, where the high school 13 in the 2017 feasibility study was recommended for 2024. But through the redistricting process and through the capital improvement process, it is scheduled to open in 2023. So look for the next feasibility study when it shows the differences between 17 and 18. That will be something that gets highlighted and moved up in the process. Yes. I don't know who was first.
Just to clarify, related to this, so you're showing the Board of Education's requested
Yes.
monies,
Yes.
which goes to the
County Council.
So who puts, I'll say, a new elementary school, just to take it out of the discussion of this high school group, into the budget? The Board of Ed, exactly, who has to put that budget in first?
The Board of Education.
Okay.
So if the Board of Education would, based off of feasibility study and capital improvement program, would say we need to have an elementary school in this time frame.
So as a follow-up question, if you're identifying a need for, like, I'm going to say 2030, okay, following this pattern example, it probably wouldn't be built till like 2033, but you would have known about it 4 or 5 years ahead, and it takes a couple years to go to school. So it kind of seems like you shouldn't really always be playing catch-up. I'm kind of not following why, if we're projecting it as 2021, we're not putting it in the budget until, to be built until 2024 or 2023.
Because there's only so much money that goes around. That's really the answer, and Bruce can speak to this more directly. Funding has been decreasing, and so the county council can restore certain funding, but it's really a lump sum. They don't say you have to spend it here, 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 and here. Am I correct in that, Bruce?
Yes, you are. If you look at high school number 13, can everybody hear me? If you look at high school number 13, originally I believe it started out in the year 2028, a couple of years ago. And the previous administration instructed us to accelerate the school, and we moved it to 2024. And I want you to pay particular attention to what I just said, the previous administration. With all due respect, I live here. And this is a planner's, for lack of words, a kind of a nightmare this year, because we're going to have a new Board of Education, we're going to have a new county council, we might have a new county executive, and every time there's a change of leadership in the county, it changes. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been here for 30 years. I've served 5 different superintendents. I work for Dr. Michael Martirano, and I serve his agenda right now. The constraints that are put up on us by funding is dramatic. 30 years ago, we didn't think about anything. We built real expensive schools. We didn't worry about state funding, and it was all on our backs. Now we garner every little penny that we can get. We comply with every state rule and regulations. I'm extremely courteous, and I can beg for money from the state. So the funding, as our needs have gone up, the funding level has leveled off at the local level, and mix in a change in state government with a new administration in the public school construction program who wants to change everything. So we're a little bit topsy-turvy this year. We're doing the best we can, and this budget that the council passes on the 31st has been amended. We've constructed 23 different iterations since last July the 2nd to meet the changing needs of the county. There was a recommendation that was set forth about high school number 13. Executive Kittleman said, let's advance it by 2 years. Well, the problem with that is when you advance it by 2 years, you still have to get the facility built in those years. And you can't, it's really just about impossible to build a 250,000 square foot high school, even a prototype high school, And we say prototype, but everything will change on the next high school. I mean, programmatic needs are significantly changed, as well as building code needs. So it's kind of a changing game as we go along, and we adapt with the money. And my favorite page of the capital budget is the 10-year page, because we have to think about what the taxpayers and citizens of this county can encumber as we move forward. And you know, it's getting, and this is all public information, it's in the capital budget, it is getting to be a six-figure ask of the council. And I've been here for a long time, and I've watched it gradually creep up. One of the big drivers is cost of buildings. 3 years ago, we were at $260 a square foot. We're currently at $360 a square foot. And that is a national and state average that's compiled, and those are our guidelines. So it's a battle between needs and what we have, and we make the adjustments. Like I said, that 10-year look ahead, you know, we know that we're not going to see the funding that we project out over those 10 years, so we change. And then we get a new Board of Education, and they might decide to change some things. If we get, you know, or we get new leadership at the government level, they might request we change some things. So these are all the different changing standards that I've seen for a number of years. And it's quite interesting and it's quite fascinating. And we tried to stay 3 steps ahead. Like I said, it took 20+ iterations of the capital budget since last July the 2nd, you know, to adapt and conquer. I mean, I don't know if any of you watched it as the superintendent wanted to advance, and I know this is probably not the best subject to say, the Hammond High School project. Yeah. And when that was advanced, I sat there and I had to report on the affected projects. You advance a $100 million project, you've got $100 million worth of projects to be reconsidered. Right. So these are the standards that Ms. Kamen and Mr. Lubley have to work with, and you know, and I try to balance the dollars and cents because I can see things globally from both perspectives.
So the price per square footage doesn't vary across counties? You said it's a national average that we have to abide by. My understanding is that it does vary. I agree. It does vary, but we follow the state standards, ma'am. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's a set of formulas that the state gives us to calculate our square foot average, and we use that as the jump in the water, how we get started. Okay. I have one question. You mentioned, Renee, how an example with Guilford and why even kind of off where those numbers are hard to track with the apartments. So I'm just looking, you know, at the, for example, where we're at now 10 years ago. So the 2008 feasibility study for the 2 high schools that Elkridge is zoned to were 11 to 12% off of where we currently are now. So do we have a good understanding of, in Elkridge, the way you outlined with Guilford, why, I have my hunches, but why, you know, if you look 10 years ago, why we're so far off base?
I don't know that answer. 10 years ago, I was just living in this county. Mm-hmm. But we can certainly look at something like that. It's something that honestly, me and my staff would really like to dive into, but we generate our own projections, so therefore a lot of our time is into just developing the projections, and when certain things pop out year to year, we look to see, what happened here? Was it this, or this? One thing that we're curious about for next year's projection is a lot of the developers are trying to beat APFO this year. And we're getting a lot of incoming development applications, so we're really curious as to see how that will transpire in our next year's projection. Meaning not just next year for 2019, but you know, 3, 4, 5 years out, because it really takes about 5 years to build a property. So when we see things year to year, we look at it and we're like, what is that? But I don't know. I can ask my staff to see what their experiences was.
My guess is over development is my hunch, but I would just be nice to know, like, from the data that that's the projections for new development.
Yeah, those are the things that we would love to dive into to see what our demographic shifts and everything are, but because what we do and how much we do, we unfortunately can't get down to that fine level of detail, but we would really like to.
Do you guys taking in, I know it probably isn't a lot of numbers, but like Fort Meade families that are like in and out of here all the time. I know a lot of military families that live in Howard County.
If they have a Howard County, yeah, if they have a Howard County address, they're in our
They
protection.
move in and out a lot. So,
And that's what, like, for the Guilford, that's,
Right.
could be part of it. We don't look particularly at like Fort Meade or a certain driver of that. We just say, this apartment area has, you know, a lot of move-ins based on this. These general factors, what we look at. We don't drill down to, oh, that's because of Fort Meade, or oh, that's because
no, I
of
was
this.
just thinking as far as the numbers, you know.
That would be
being
one of
off.
those lovely things that we would love to look at our demographics and try and dive to see like realignment of base facilities. That would be something, of course, interesting, but I have to prioritize.
No, I was just thinking.
Yeah, no. Trust me, there's probably not anything thrown out here that me and my staff haven't talked about already.
I just wanted to ask the one back, we looked at capacities of the schools, and you explained that when a school has an addition or renovation, or if we're going to add the capacity changes, and that's totally understandable. Of course, we're going to add capacity to add space, and very often a lot of 100 seats to a school or something like that. But a lot of, and it seems some of the increases in capacity at some of the schools I was looking at seem, well, there are schools that have not had renovations or additions or any physical space changes. And programmatically, it seems difficult to explain a jump in 100 students to explain by programmatic changes inside the building. But one of the ones that caught my eye was the Hanover Hills Elementary, which is built for 780 students. The post-measures chart for that one from last year's feasibility study said 832, the capacity is 832. Why would a school built for 780 students that haven't even opened the doors yet have a jump in capacity to 832 from 780?
There's many different reasons. One, we reclaimed the community use room before it even was used as a community use room. So that's a large space. We divide it into 2 rooms. That's one way. Another way is regional pre-K. If it was slated to go into that space, we decided to convert that over to and actually use it for kindergarten classroom spaces. So these are spaces that are built already into the building, but we're actually using them for the general education population. And that's how capacities can go up and down. And like I said in the beginning, I meet regularly with our special educators and our special education department and with our pre-K and our rec program. And we work collaboratively to find, they know where the students are coming from, I know where the buildings are. We work to identify new programs, expansion of programs, and there are a multitude of different programs offered at many different schools. And if it's used for a regional program, we do not count it in capacity. So a building could still have, I'm going to say 100 rooms. If we take 25 of those rooms and we convert it over to something else, we're not counting those 25 rooms into the capacity for K through 5 education. It is the formula that was driven by the Board of Education in several years back. It's the one that we continue to use. If the current or the future Board of Education says, you know what, let's look at it differently, and they direct the superintendent to do so, then we would do the same process that we did all over again in terms of what all of our buildings look like, what is the national protocol for this, and we would go back through. And buildings have many rooms that we just don't count. For example, we don't do pre-Ks, we don't, because they're regional programs, because the K through 5 population don't have access to those spaces. It doesn't mean to say, Dan can correct me if I'm wrong, that the cafetorium and the auditorium isn't built for those children. It just means we're not counting those rooms towards capacity. If we count K through 5 and we start counting pre-K rooms, well, guess what? We're going to start counting the pre-K students as well. So even though your capacity is increasing, so is your enrollment. So you have to do an apples to apples comparison when you're looking at all of the different regional programs, plus all the regional program spaces in the building. You can't not include one thing over the other, and you can't not include that portion of the population when you're trying to figure out the enrollment, the capacity utilization as well.
And relocables are included in those
No.
non-linear capacity?
No.
They're not?
They are not.
Okay.
They are not.
Just so we can kind of look at the time and say, okay, I'm going to have you finish, and then we'll save questions, just take notes, and then we'll ask.
Sure. So I can move really quickly because we've actually kind of covered most of these slides. So the next thing we do is we break down each attendance area and look at each school and each attendance area and each region. So region can consist of multiple schools at different levels, and it's the combination of all the attendance areas for the schools listed that makes up the region. I know there's a lot of confusion because when you look at like the Northeast region, it's a little different in terms of the shape. So basically this part of the feasibility goes through what are the needs, what's the projection looking like, what is the capacity. If a projection blips, we don't necessarily on a certain year want to recommend a capacity project for that. We want to look, is it steady? Is it continual? We look at our past that informs us for the future. Is this something that's going to continue to happen? And at that point, we might say, okay, well, you know what? We know that if there's a renovation project coming up, maybe we should look at capacity when that renovation is coming up. Or is it an entire region need, or is it an adjacent region need that we can kind of tag on to the planning project to add capacity or redistricting, or maybe it's relocatables that is more temporary. And then we identify the strategy. So, okay, we've identified the need, what is our strategy? Then we have this section here called the foreseeable attendance area adjustments, also known as redistricting. And this is where when we have a new capacities coming online or what have you, and this is actually from the 2016 feasibility study. You're not going to see this in the 2017. And the reason I did this is because 2017 was completely different. It actually had a redistricting plan in it. So foreseeable attendance area adjustments can also look like, you know what, we know we're going to have a school coming in online. What do we as staff, what is that going to look like when the actual process happens? How many students do we anticipate coming in? And we have a full discussion of that in this particular section. And then we have the pre and post measure charts. These are not AFO charts. They look like AFO charts, but they are not AFO charts because they don't have the critical final Board of Education capacities, projects, capital budget, and capital improvement program in it. This is our attempt to kind of have some kind of comparability that says, if you do these things, this is the result. You might get, you might resolve certain issues that we're seeing. So the pre-measures is what it's like now, and the post would include any kind of capacity additions or anything. So these, I think these are also from the 2016 feasibility. No, this is from the, 2016. So it will show capacities for each of the years, and then if there are any projects, and I want to say there are no projects in this one. If there were any projects, you would see the change in capacity. If there were any moves for the regional program, you would see those in this chart. Okay, I'm done.
Thank you.
Is it possible, and maybe it was already, I apologize if it was already typed, is it possible to get like an electronic version of these slides so that we can?
I apologize, I was rushing out the door and I meant to send it to Andrew, but yeah, I have the electronic so that it can get posted online and we all can get a copy.
Great.
So while you're thinking of your question, I'm going to say we take a 5-minute recess. Motion to recess.
Are you allowed to make the motion in 1 second?
Can I do that?
Okay.
I'm still new at this. So.
doing great.
Okay, all right, 5 minutes. Okay.
Hey, you finished 1 minute early.
Did I really?
High five.
I don't have my watch on, I got nothing.
And that's considering we started late.
We use that too. When a computer hits too small to look at, we project.
Projections are all, first
That's not one too. Words are precious, man.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it's probably all, it's probably on Orthodox, so I didn't know, but it could be on Orthodox. Should be on Orthodox.
Is there a little cafe on front of that?
Yes.
So there's vending, there's not like an
I just
actual.
need something
Yeah,
to drink.
yeah.
Okay.
So did you look in Ravelry to see if the,
No, I should.
I mean, it should be.
Yeah.
It should be. I was surprised because I went, and I had looked a couple other times in my messages.
Right.
Because before, like, I've had patterns and like maybe the person like needs to change, to the pattern. And then I get a message and it says, so-and-so is uploaded, so I was looking, I thought there would be a message. And there wasn't. I was like, I guess she hasn't sent it yet. Then today I just looked in the library and there it is. And it says it's been there since like May 2nd or something. Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that. And did you block it?
No, I don't even know.
I don't know if we have to, like, I don't know if it needs to be blocked, I guess I may go to, the yarn store and ask for it. And like how, because it's sort of curved, so I don't know how you would block that. But I'm excited to be finally almost done. I really enjoyed it for a while, and then towards the end, I was like, oh my God.
So, and we throw
forever,
yeah.
yes.
250
Yes,
pages.
yes. Well, and like, I mean, I
don't like
tried
using
to
words in the
finish the
Yeah.
row before I stopped, but
Yeah.
then,
I know,
when it got that much, I
it's taking 40
couldn't.
minutes a row.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, very informative. And thank you so much.
Mom was like, 250
Thank you.
stitches, what are you
We
doing?
work as a team, so it's usually easier to have the whole team.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is only 2 of them.
Yeah.
It was
You
fun,
do.
I
How many
enjoyed
people
that.
do you have there?
We'll have to.
So in my office,
you
there's
know,
only 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
plan a
Plus
council
Mary.
meeting where
And
we all
then
three
Bruce is
were,
responsible for all of us. And how many are in construction?
Yeah.
7. And then
just sitting in a row.
transportation is also on there for us.
Which is me.
Yes.
You switch your hats and things. Yeah, it's a lot of data, so.
What else happened?
So yes, that was really good.
What's going on this week? Oh, are you going
It's
to?
a lot to
I'm gonna try, yes. So that's my plan. The problem is, like, depends on my whole, like, out of it now, because I have this. And then tomorrow I have to come over.
Tomorrow I have I've got Girl Scouts, because I moved my Girl Scout meeting from last Tuesday.
Close like hours, it's like, I live like right down the street.
So I may,
I think the rate is
I know it all goes together.
but I may have to ask Michael, like, if he wants to go, maybe I'll watch it.
Yes, it did, and then everything.
He says he wants to go. Because that might be a way around.
But I will take the
Getting that every night, like, is it
Yeah,
helps with
I have
things.
I didn't know. I was
Like,
like-
one going out.
They showed it to the kids.
Yeah.
I don't know, we'll just show you something.
Yeah, Maria pretty much. But of course, like, so yeah, so that's Tuesday, so I'm hoping to go to both of these, like,
Well, and dogs.
So like, can I pay them?
Thursdays also.
Oh, God, yes.
Which is
I'm very, I have 4 boys, and as they're becoming like
so,
teenagers,
yeah, it's a busy week.
it's like, they're just getting there. Like,
You're the beastie bag.
No, Stacy.
I'm
So they don't, Scott was tweeting that, I don't know, the case manager's endorsing it.
Yeah, we know that.
I heard that.
Well, I was gonna say, I had heard it weeks ago, the rumors of it, but.
Promo went out.
Yeah.
Promo went out. Kate, Maya, and others. On the-
I was at last night, just Clarence.
Yeah.
I think everybody that's like content is all about technology and these.
Well, yeah. And the bus takes my
Especially in my
and he works indoors.
I tried to I have a person in my office who's amazing at doing layman's terms. Oh, yeah. So before I send any anything, I'm like, here, read it. And she does. She
That's why you have a team.
Yeah, that's what we do. It's amazing. And that's why I was really late to this.
All right, let's go back to the seat.
She's like, oh, we want to make some changes.
So,
Yeah, they.
There were typos over there. Yes.
In 2020, your electric one heard.
Now, do we vote?
What happened?
I'm gonna let the
Edit,
folks do their editing that and make that determination.
Okay, I think they edited it out. I was like having a conversation, I was like,
That's the only way it got out of the
I mean, it wasn't anything horrible, but it's just,
Sure.
to.
Okay, all right, we're gonna start.
yeah, discussing that for
And Jose had to leave early. All right, does anyone have any questions for Renee? We've got a couple minutes, so.
One is the zoning change. So if there was a property that was, for example, zoned commercial, industrial, what would be the process? Would a school, what would you have to do to determine if that was a good site for a school to change the zoning or make it appropriate for a school?
I think public uses are permitted, I would have to double check, but I think in most of the zoning, school or like community use is permitted by right. It would just depend on it. Like in terms of the state approvals, if it was outside of the public, it's called PFA, so that's public funding area, which also means it doesn't have water and sewer connection. We would have to go most likely and do a zoning amendment because the zoning density is too low. So in order to change, like if it was just a property just outside of the PFA, we would actually have to go through a zoning amendment and possibly a comprehensive plan amendment. I don't think in Elkridge we're going to have that problem, but it's just something to be aware of. But I'm pretty sure that, and I can go back and check, that a community use or a government use is permitted by right in most instances.
Okay.
Is that in most zonings in general?
I think in most zoning in general. It's been a while. It's been a while since I've read the zoning ordinance of Howard County, but
Do you know if it's including the CDC a lot?
that I don't know. That I don't know.
So just for the sake of, if the zoning amendment was required, that can be done at any time. It's not the same as that 5-year cycle of zoning change.
Okay, so the way, all right, I'm gonna put my zoning hat on, because it's been a while. I used to be a zoning analyst in my last job. You only can change zoning in 2 ways. One is a change in the community, and the second is through a floating zone application. So I would have to look at the zoning, the actual zoning of it to determine
Okay.
Because you have to make a case that there's a change in the community, and that's likely the angle or the road you would have to take.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then for the site review committee, are there any potential high school sites or areas or parcels in Elkridge that have gone through that process currently?
Currently, I think it was only, recently it was the Rockburn, right, the landing road site, right? The
Not
landing
Troy
road
Park.
site.
Troy Park didn't go through that.
Troy Park did.
It did.
Troy Park went through
Yeah,
site review. Yeah, Troy Park
The
did.
Board of Education instructed staff to pursue the Troy Park site. And I do know that the state went in there and looked at the site. I don't know if we have the results back yet.
No, we did not from the state.
Okay, so they're pending.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Troy did go through SRC as well as landing.
Okay.
Yes, Troy did, yes.
Anybody else?
Do we have specific areas that they need to stay within, like they know? Is this how we're kind of like?
No.
Okay.
No. So in terms of, those areas are really our best way to look at a region and be able to make, like, look at a particular geographic area to say, this is what we're seeing in this general area. If a school is outside the area, that's fine with us. If we redistrict, whenever we're doing any type of redistricting or boundary line adjustment, it doesn't have to be within that particular area. That he's pointing to the Columbia East area, I believe is the map. It can cross regions.
Okay, but for the most part, I want to stay somewhere around this.
Well, I would think that since this is Elkridge, you would have to define what Elkridge is. I've talked to several different people. Elkridge means a lot of different things to people out there, so it would just have, you can make that decision. I wouldn't.
And then, anybody else have any other questions? Which school, do we know which schools it's going to be pulling from? Because I assume that we're going to be taking students from other schools because they're at capacity, is that correct?
So it would depend on, where the
districting process.
So it would depend on where the school site ended up ultimately being. If it's within the attendance area of Howard, it would obviously take Howard students.
Okay.
If it's relatively close to Long Reach, it could take from both. It's one of those things that once the site is determined, we can kind of look to say, generally speaking, it would take about this area. Yes.
Going back in your slides a bit, you talked about the migration of the school population. And I wasn't sure if you were speaking that in reference to the migration of students from community to community, or you're talking on like a regional basis, and how do you track and project this?
So all of our projections, so I'm talking the region-wide, the shifting migration pattern, period. And then with the projection, it would be counting in the projection on whatever different level that we would see it in apartment turnover, resales of houses. There are neighborhoods right now that I'm driving through that I know are 55 and older, and they're reselling their house right now in Columbia area. So that's what I mean by the cycle, the turnover cycle. And so things like that would be counted in our different metrics, whether it be through a resale, new construction, or apartment turnover.
And is there some kind of specialized software that does this, or is this like a really fancy Excel sheet? Like, I'm trying to visualize.
Oh, you want to know what our okay, so right now it's called the Whipper. Our projection software right now is the Whipper. We just recently purchased new redistricting software that comes with the projection software. So it was developed in-house for our particular needs. So three planning managers ago and developers ago, we had someone who was really good at database and really good at programming. And so it's our own programming tool. And is not user-friendly in terms of, unless you're working with it every day of every week, you get to know its quirks. So it works off of Excel, it works off of GIS, And it ultimately produces tables in Microsoft Excel. And that Microsoft Excel, after we input all of the actual physical data points, it runs its own program, and it's a program. So you do your inputs, you tell it to run, and it runs. It's not Windows based whatsoever. So then once that happens, then tables come out of that. We import it into Excel, which is where we're able to manipulate the outputs of that data. And we're able to use things like 2-year, 1 year, or 1, 2, 3, and 5 year averages for the different variables that we look at. And it even fits into it. We have a best fit analysis, so even the Excel spreadsheet tells us what is the best year or average of years to use when you're looking at cohort survival or you're looking at new construction yield. So it's both an art and a science, our projections, like anything. There's certain factors that we know that certain schools have a higher turnover rate, so we might make certain choices in our projection to reflect that. So it's a combination of programs that we use. Now, I said all of that. We recently purchased a new redistricting software because our WIFR does both our projection and our redistricting. There are 2 different components of it. But the software we just purchased last year also has a projection component in it. So we're trying to, in the off year and this summer, see if we can build our projection in it as well and measure its accuracy and its needs to make sure that we can even use the software over in our projection world. So it's more of a GIS, and then it will be supported by a company as opposed to one person who retired about 15, 20 years ago, so that we can move.
So the new software has a redistricting component, which is mostly why it was purchased, it sounds like.
Yeah.
It has this projection capability too, that really hasn't been dealt into yet.
It hasn't, we're actually, Tim is setting it up. So it's one of those things, he actually had to set up the projection in this particular software using what we've developed, and he had to put it into this system. So for next year, we'll be able to put the inputs in raw and be able to use this, and we'll still have to build it in the WIFR because we want some kind of comparability between the two to make sure that they're both on par, and if not, what kind of tweaks or what have you that we need to build in, what kind of other data do we need for this new software or not need. So we need that kind of your buffer before we roll out onto a new projection software.
Thank you.
Nobody else? Okay. So the next meeting we're going to be talking about is, I think it would be good to have some sort of a rubric, some sort of a baseline for when we're using these tools, when we're looking at, like Renee had said, like what is Elkridge, and you know, when we're looking at locations and we're looking at sites, something that we can, you know, kind of check off. It meets, you know, policy 6,000, it's centrally located, cost analysis, all these types of things. So, do we have a board? Can I write these down? Or you can just
I'll write them down.
So Andrew, so what I thought is, you know, but we don't have any dry erase, so. You have
I have one in my car. I knew on the brake track.
So if we outline like an area that we want to actually not go outside of, and just pick a certain acreage, I can pinpoint every parcel that's in that area that's that acreage or larger, that we can then, next meeting, sit down and get the region everyone to talk about.
Or a combination of adjacent parcels.
If you do that, you'd have the entire trade area.
Right. I mean, there's just some, yeah, because there's just some areas that might make sense that, you know, that would be next to each other, like along Route 1. But if we know those, we could arrange this with them.
The Greater Elkridge Community Association defines the area they consider, they've always considered to be Elkridge, and it's basically contained, last time I checked, the same areas as, nothing has grown, it's grown inside that area, but I don't think that it's grown outside that.
Yeah.
So could we use their map and their boundary determinations?
That's an excellent idea. So
Fine.
it's already done, and we don't really.
We don't have to reinvent the wheel.
No.
What is it?
So it's actually not a map. I mean, it's just like a list of
Yeah.
north on this street until this. I mean, it's a very, say it again?
It's a legal.
I mean, yeah, it's in the bylaws of the community association.
Yeah.
It defines what the,
Yeah, it could be put into a map form, but.
Yeah,
it's
I think it's
described.
essentially 21075 and 76. I mean, there might be like a little bit of, but that's essentially,
Like Elkridge, Hanover.
yeah.
276 still Howard County, or is it split?
It's split.
There's a piece of it that's sort of.
so it would be the 21076 part, that is Howard
Howard
County, would be included in the part
Because
that's
that's what gets
not.
me confused, because I work in the Anne Arundel County part of
Oh, yeah.
2076, and I always go to say my 21075 zip code, and
Yeah.
flip around all the time.
So do we just want to say 21075 or 21076 Howard County?
Does 21075 go all the way down to 175?
That would make
Port
sense.
County.
They're down to where?
Which is almost there.
No.
They're down to how far?
Pardon?
175.
175.
I'm pretty sure the Costco is 275.
It is.
It is.
So
Does it
that
go
and
down
then
to
108.
175?
I think it's onto the
And then
data.
what's that?
I think it's like onto the data.
You got down Route 1 to 175.
Yeah, it goes
That's
all
how
the way.
So I think
Those
175 is
Port
like the
Capital,
breaking
if you
line.
want to
Okay,
go
then
that
I-
way.
Elkridge and, is that from Jessica? Or?
I don't know. I was gonna say, it also goes
Side-
up.
Side.
Well, that's
Yeah.
21076, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, yeah, we could use it because that's probably easier than trying to do.
Are we speaking of looking at the zip code for determination and looking at property list, or are we speaking of zip code in terms of defining our rubric for what is Elkridge?
So I
think those are two different things.
Right, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to confuse you. I was just kind of going off what Renee said, thinking about that. The rubric is really going to be the expectations, like, do these properties meet these expectations? Defining Elkridge, so I didn't mean. But it's kind of in conjunction because it's property with, within Elkridge.
My guess is it doesn't have to locate in Elkridge, it just, it's supposed to be general within that vicinity, correct? Or not? So it could, in theory, be an Elkridge City or Columbia, or are we trying to stay away from it?
I think we're trying to stay.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that it's just the sun.
Yeah.
We already zoned for we already just did for high schools in Columbia and Elkridge, so move it into our own community.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of think maybe in terms of rubric, what we want to say is like, has to be within 275 or the Howard County 21076, and not so close to the edge that it's too
considered
far
a
or that it's too far for kids within that area. I mean, we want it, not completely central, but at least central enough that it can serve a large enough population of Elkridge to make it worthwhile.
Like this building is centrally located, ideal in Elkridge. Yes, we have people who live over on the west side, but we also have people who live in Hanover, so we're
Right.
kind of in the middle, like.
Right, but something that's like on the very edge of Hanover, like right on the Howard County Anne Arundel line, might not be ideal because then kids are just gonna be on the bus just as long as they are
We have an
now.
elementary.
Right, for example,
Well,
that's
that's
would be an example of that. We could avoid that.
So we can just say centrally located within.
I think that still creates the argument of, well, what is Elkridge?
I would like to suggest suggest that the task force using our rubric, the definition of Elkridge that is provided by CACA, and that it's been a long-standing organization in the community that we're trying to serve. I'm open for other definitions, but I kind of against recreating the wheel. I feel like that does provide a definition of Elkridge beyond just the neighborhood of that area, because it does belong to Hanover, and it has some boundaries that fall along major roads, and feature boundaries.
And I wonder if the original GECO, because original, long time ago, Elkridge was 21227, just like Baltimore County. So I wonder if that's where the Elkridge 2122, where once they became 21075, they expanded the Elkridge name. I wonder if that's where the original Elkridge boundary.
The boundary on, so I live in an area that would now be what would have been the 21227.
Right, so
and that it is defined in that boundary, because I believe it talks about that edge going to what that would be the Tapsco River. So that utilizing that land feature as a boundary, because it is a county boundary in that perspective.
Right. I mean, we can certainly, if we can get a map.
We have the map of it that someone highlighted recently.
And if we want to create that. Yeah, do you want to send me that, that description of it?
Sure.
And I can probably have it drawn up for us.
Yeah. Yes, I can just cut and paste it on our file.
I completely agree. We don't need to. All right, so any other, I mean, there's obviously like policy 6,000, that would be something that we would, in the feasibility study and all those, but I don't think we should have that as a separate, it can cover everything in the rubric. Not everything in the rubric, but everything under policy 6,000, the feasibility study, as far as like using that as a tool when we're looking at properties. So that could be another.
So as a rubric, it would be, does the property meet policy 6,000 considerations?
And then there were these other factors that Renee mentioned about desirable and usable acres, right? So like things that would make it more challenging that maybe wouldn't kick it out, but we have to consider would be easements, conservation areas, topography, slope, wetlands, that may make it more or less desirable.
What are the constraints on usable acreage?
And we're looking at, the goal of 46 to 47 desirable usable acre.
The slide said it was 36.
Yeah.
And now.
Yes, we can't get away, but I'm saying that from my notes.
There's a difference between the educational specification and what they have outlined as schools that have actually built under the 36 point, whatever it was, acreage, which Long Reach is on that, and Marriage Ridge is on that, and Reservoir is on that number of acres. And
Who's on the 36 scale?
yeah, those three schools are all in the same. There's the same model, basically. Walk in any one of them and sort of it's the same square footage, the same model school. And they've, they've got efficient field acreage and really all of that. So I don't want to confine ourselves to defining the need for more acreage than we can do where, something that HGPSS has already done and it works. So
I know what you're saying.
I don't want to say we need 47 acres when we can find 36. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I was just saying the minimum, that was a desirable, but then I would say, like, the minimum is 36 point.
Right, so we can look in that range.
Correct. Is, I guess,
So we're saying the minimum is 36 usable?
and a quarter.
Usable.
Yeah, 36.
But ideal.
Does that include the inefficiency?
Yes.
Yes.
So the rubric question would be, is the property at least 36 1/4 acres?
Yeah.
Use 36 usable acres.
Use.
So something to keep in mind is that as we're looking at properties, we're never going to know what's usable, what's not until it's collection.
But we
Do you
should
guys
be
have
able to-
in-house resources that can
So
determine that?
there's an awesome website for Howard County government, it's their interactive map. I can share you the link. You can easily determine there are certain things on there, like floodplains. There are certain informational pieces that you can kind of spec out, like forest conservation easements, wetlands, slopes, that's all there. So I can send you the link if you'd like.
Topography on it, and then we'll show
Parcel
any,
boundaries.
we'll show any streams or anything
Yeah.
we can do, okay?
Yeah, I should have left my computer up, I could have given you a quick tutorial on it. But yeah, it's an awesome, piece of information out there. If you can get parcel level information, you can find out who owners are, all of that.
What's the distance requirement from the floodplain? Because that one seems to come up a lot. How far?
That's a damn question. There's a 100-foot buffer usually on it, and then there's something else on the wetlands that we usually have to avoid.
It varies depending on the type of wetlands. I mean, if you're dealing with a 100-year floodplain, or if you're dealing with just a standard wetland or a stream, if it's a standard stream, you're looking closer to a 25-foot buffer.
Okay.
Well, does that website you have show like springs and stuff like that? Elkridge is loaded with springs.
I don't think it shows you
Like
springs.
one of them red or anything else?
I don't think it shows that level of detail,
Okay.
but that's probably a question we could ask their environmental person if there's a particular, is there anything else we need to be aware of? There are a couple of different websites, like Maryland State has historic information on it. It also has archaeological information on it that I can send you guys. And there was another one that I just lost, but there are like 3 different places to check for information.
Okay.
Because then you have like scenic easements and those types of things that's not on the.
Okay.
So I'll send you what I got.
Okay, and so sort of a combination of that should give us a pretty good idea of what's usable.
Yeah, you just have to keep overlaying
Yeah.
all of the stuff on top of it, and you can kind of drill down to what looks good.
Because we were talking about centrally located, one of the things I had in my notes was centrally located to walkers. That's something that is desirable, I know. When we're looking at sites, it got brought up with high school 13. I think that, what do you guys feel?
And that's part of policy.
That would be a policy 6,000 consideration.
I don't want to put it in our rubric because while it's desirable, I don't think we want to make it, it's very constraining.
Yeah.
To have that be part of it because, you know, if you find a site off Route 1, for example, you're not going to, just by practicality, not going to have that many walkers, not going to have that many houses right there close to it. If you have students across Route 1 or a neighborhood across Route 1 and they can't get across Route 1 safely.
Well, and we have so few sidewalks, like, there's very.
The sidewalks that go nowhere.
Exactly, so I mean, even on Montgomery Road, like, there aren't walkers because there's not sidewalks.
The only reason I had it in my notes and was bringing it up was because that seemed to be an issue when they were looking at picking the site. And I want to make sure that I completely agree, it goes under policy 6.7. I just want to make sure, and I'm not pressing that this should be part of the rubric. I'm just saying that I want to make sure that we take out as many roadblocks as possible to putting aside, kind of like learning from the past, like what have we taken from not being able to have high school. So,
Yeah, I mean, I sort of feel like maybe that is, if we have two sites that we're deciding between, and that could be a deciding factor.
Right.
But if we can't find anything that is
Right.
workable,
It shouldn't
I don't
be
think we say, there's
yeah.
nothing in Elkridge.
It shouldn't be a cut and
No.
dry, yes.
It shouldn't be the thing that decides if we go
Right,
forward
right.
or don't.
Right. I was just, this is kind of just
Yes.
brainstorming,
No, I-
just throwing out ideas out there. So like, it might be stuff that we say, oh no, this one don't want, so.
Can I interject on the usable side?
Yes, please, yes.
Just something to keep in mind, most of the sites are not going to fall into this situation, but I would highly suggest if you're thinking of a site, don't just look at the numbers, look at the actual, like this interactive map, for instance, because there's a lot of sites that you're going to look at, just picking out numbers, and say you have 100 acres, and you start to whittle it down, and you say, oh great, we have 40 acres, but those 40 acres are stretched out over that 100 acres. Yeah, when you start to put a school on it, think of how also that school is going to be used. And if the school's here, but your tennis courts are a quarter mile away, are they really going to be used? So that's another item to just think about.
Definitely cost. I feel cost analysis should be in there. Did you put that down?
Do you have any idea what the budget is for the acquisition? So I feel like we should care about cost. I don't think there's going to be 100 options.
I mean, for high school 13, it's 125-ish million, so, but there is no.
That's the total.
Total,
Yeah.
complete construction, everything, right? Oh, you just mean for acquisition.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a kind of, right.
You had $360 a square foot, that was including the land cost, I would assume, right?
Yes, it was.
Do you know what the?
302
So,
square foot.
three-
The cost for our elementary school number 13 was right at 90, 88, 95, 99.
You know, the 90 million is the cost of the high school, but that is for
Yes.
site building and the actual, it's total project cost on our end. It did not include the cost of purchase or acquire the land.
Did not, okay, did not.
Correct.
Acquisition.
Yeah, that deal's not done.
So how would we be able to put a rubric cost? We're only going to be able to put a cost comparison in as an estimate between sets because we don't have a budget number to work with. And that's fair. That's where we are.
Right.
I would think it's very likely that we're going to find a lot of things that aren't for sale too, so there's going to be no cost associated with it because it's going to be, we have to just say, hey, that's all we can.
And we are limited if we're looking in Elkridge with Lakeburg area.
Sorry, that.
We're limited, we're strapped for viable. So,
How can we put into our rubric, just kind of trying to think outside the box, I think we could all agree that there's not going to be, 5 parcels of more than 40 acres around there because somebody would have already found them. So I think we're going to need to think outside the box in terms of collection of properties, redevelopment of properties. So how would we be able to add something to our rubric to weight the fact that we're taking a redevelopment effort that's going to improve kind of the greater area and provide an opportunity for a high school college.
I don't know how many acres I saw some video clips that they said like 2 years, 3 years ago.
If you're looking for how much something sold, you would have to find the deed of the mortgage through that website. You can get the property information from the interactive map, and you can get the assessed value. Not all the times can you get the sale price on those, but I think you can, that's a public record that you can get through looking for the deed. I'm not sure.
I think the county just sold it for the acre property like 4 or 5 years ago.
I have no idea.
I think, Christie, to speak to your question, the rubric question could be, how will the property be acquired? Would it be purchased? Would it be redeveloped? Would it be collected?
And also, does it offer any community enhancement? I think that's the
Yeah,
second part of what you're speaking to.
Yeah, I think we have the acquisition element of it. Will it be a straight acquisition? Will it be redevelopment? Will it be collection? Right. I was trying to add more of a element of layering this into the greater Route 1 redevelopment and having this be a newer community, larger community scale kind of asset in that redevelopment process. And how can we put a measure in to speak to that? And I don't see that as being like an acquisition type of rubric. It's kind of more a little bit art and science and a little bit more touchy-feely than math or economics. But I think that would be something we should consider putting in our rubric.
So how would this property contribute to the improvement of Elkridge?
Be a community enhancement.
Argument, I mean, maybe this is too broad, you empower 2030 if it's through Route 1 revitalization.
I like the idea of maybe
Does it
considering
contribute?
that. Does it contribute to the goals of Plan Route 1 2030?
So how would the property be acquired? And does the property contribute to?
Plan Howard 2030, specifically the Route 1 revitalization. Assuming, that'll only be for sites in that area, but I think we're all aware that that's probably where we're looking at this point. If there's something on the other side that we haven't found, then wonderful, but it's a little passes.
Is Howard 2030
The general plan of the county.
the one that every year?
Yes.
And isn't the county looking at the quarter study? Are we doing a quarter study of revitalization of Route 1?
We're putting out bids for that.
Put out bids for it, so that's probably something you want to look at too. That's,
I don't know how long it's gonna be until it's done, yeah.
it's not gonna be, it's not gonna
Yeah.
be done in this time frame, but maybe there might be something in
Preliminary,
that
yeah.
that could tie in.
Yeah, and this is really kind of a guide, so it's not a, just as we're looking at it, if something's way off base, we're going to say no. I think we all, so it's a guide, it's not a.
These properties scored 10 on.
Right, exactly. We're not getting a score, we will. Anybody?
I know last time we had talked about like a list, or some kind of list of properties that have been looked at, or that, so I guess if there's any information that's already available, that could be shared.
So that actually leads me, are we done with the river part? But this kind of leads into the next, talking about like the next steps for next time we meet. After we approve the minutes and we look at kind of approving a rubric that we've talked about tonight, we're going to discuss locations. I think Renee's believe that's some historical. Did we talk about that? Yeah. Okay. So she's going to be pulling up some locations, and then the county also has. We're going to end up going into a closed section, so we can review those sites, and if and when the county does decide to pursue purchasing those, it will not interfere with negotiations. So we will have a list of those sites at the next meeting, which the next meeting will be June 4th, Monday, June 4th. is everyone okay with meeting here at the library for the next couple of meetings? I think this is a good.
Do you have meeting times?
So that's one thing I wanted to bring up. I know we talked about meeting at 5:30. I personally, and I can do 5:30, I feel like 5:30 is rushed. Because I know some people work till 5, sometimes with traffic, so I'm suggesting 6 o'clock.
Yeah,
So
I
we
think
don't have any, so 6 to 8 instead of 5:30 to 7:30.
that works for me. I mean, I think we had wanted to do 5:30 because that seemed to work best for Ananta, but since he wasn't able to be here tonight anyway, I don't know if 5:30 versus 6 would have made a difference. So if that cuts him out, I would say let's stick with 5:30. If he can make 6, I think 6 is probably better.
Okay, I mean, I can do 5:30, but I know that, like, my place of business isn't closed till 6, so it's just sometimes hard to, I didn't make adjustments, but I didn't know how everybody was feeling. After I thought about it after we left, but I think we can check with the notas, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I would prefer 6. It was a squeeze to get here, but I can do it.
Okay, I just.
What time are we going to be meeting a month, then do we expect?
So just once a month. So the email I had sent about, so we're looking at Monday, June 4th, Monday, July 16th, Monday, August 6th, and then the first Monday of the month in September is Labor Day. So we're looking at Tuesday, September 11th.
Once every month and a half.
It's intended to be once a month, but because of like the holidays.
Holidays,
it's just
how it runs, because of Labor Day, or 4th of July. So traditionally, we're supposed to, but summer's upon us, so. But I think I sent the email back. I can resend it out when I send out.
Is there, Andrew, could you send out invite to everybody, recurring all these dates?
Like a calendar.
Just so if something changes,
Mhm.
everybody will get it. Somebody doesn't show up for nothing.
So what time would you guys expect?
Yes, I will double check.
And I worked with the library and we reserved this room for that room, the next room, for the rest of 2018.
Terrific, thank you.
So if we want to continue to meet here, we can do that.
That's great.
Thank you.
We had thrown us out schools and then, you know, asking maybe to fire, rotating it, but it just seems, for simplicity's sake, one location.
And I think this is pretty
It is,
special.
yes.
It's a nice compromise if you're coming from Columbia or coming from, you know, to come from.
Right. Yeah. All right, so next time we meet, we're gonna go ahead and then we'll have the rubric, and we can add things to that if we need to. And then we'll also have those locations, so we'll go into a closed session, and my vision, and we can talk about this, you know, when we look at the location, is kind of breaking up into groups to examine each of the sites. And David would probably kind of take lead on looking as far as, I'm just saying, putting this out there. As far as, you know, the acreage and like if we have to put parcels together and things like that, since it's kind of your expertise. Because that is a real, that's a reality for Elkridge, because we have all these little pieces of land that we might have to look at.
Do you have a couple like that that are already in mind? Are they all owned by the same?
Are you ready for the challenge?
Can we do that then with the main thing?
Something to talk about.
Which that's something we're going to be educated on and debate, and I just want to make that clear that that's not something that we have that, and I think I made this, let me rewind. We as a committee are just making recommendations. We are not making decisions. That's up to the county council, or I'm sorry, the county executive as to whether it's a recommendation. And the same with like eminent domain, that's all county, that has nothing to do. And I think the Board of Ed can do eminent domain too, can't they?
Yes,
Yes.
we've done eminent domain before.
Do what?
Eminent domain.
Oh.
You can't.
No, we can, but we've not had an
One time in
experience.
30 years.
I
We
just
try
wanted
not to. We try to work it out.
Right, so we would like to become educated on the process. So we have a solicitor, is that correct, too?
Gary Cook, the solicitor, the county solicitor.
So he will come at a meeting, probably the July meeting, or the next.
So, one program opens this week also, at a future meeting, talk about that.
That's a good idea, program.
You know, how that works, or replace that land.
That's a great idea.
So jumping back to the rubric for a minute.
Yes.
If we're designing a rubric that then we're going to use as a guide to make our recommendations, and it's not clear to me now, given this topic of eminent domain coming up, if that should be on our rubric. Would that fall under the acquisition?
I think
That's
how
what
is
I'm
it
implying.
acquired?
How is it acquired, right? Because if we were to look at scoring, I think we would all agree that nobody really wants to do that domain. But it's a tool on the table, even if it's not a tool we want to go after.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I wanted to make sure that was.
And similar with the program open space, right, it's not something we, like, ideally, we would not want to have to even consider do that, but it would be good to just have it as part of it.
And program open space would be a constraint on the
Yes, you have to
usable
replace
acreage.
the land, if, yes, depending on what it is the land is used for.
Right. Yes, so these are all tools. I just want to be clear. A lot of people upset that these are tools and we are just using them to, actually not using them, but we are making recommendations and going through the whole process. All right. Anything else? Thank you again. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Yes, it was very informative. I appreciate it. All right, somebody like to
I move to adjourn.
I second that.
all in favor? All right, thank you all very much, and I'll see you June 4th. I don't see you before then. See you Thursday. If you have anything, let me know.
June what?
June 4th. I'll resend out that.